We had a bit of technical problems, but thank you all for coming. Welcome to a new webinar of the Central Bank of Chile. Today, we are happy to have Marcus Hagerdorn, who is a professor at the University of Oslo. He has worked extensively on labor markets and problems with heterogeneity at the macro level as well. Today, he will present us a demand theory of the price level. And before we giving you the stage, Marcus, let me say some things about the seminar rules. We want this to be as close as possible as a regular one. So we will make all assistants a panelist, and the panelists can ask and interrupt you whenever they want. We have until your 5 p.m. in Oslo. So without further ado, Marcus, the floor is yours.
It's almost, yeah. Thanks a lot for having me. It's almost 4 p.m. in Oslo, so everybody's going home now. I'm all by myself. So I say thanks again for having me to talk about demand theory of the price level, and also apologize for the inconvenience and for my that was a little bit complicated. But now I'm ready to start, and as I said, I want to talk about the demand theory of the price level. It's going to be a new way to think about how inflation and prices are determined, and we're going to see that we have that fiscal policy is going to have a large role in that view that I'm trying to propose today. But before I want to move to this, let me start with the prevailing view that we have. It's a new Keynesian view. You can find this, for example, in the textbooks by Woodford and Gali. And let me summarize the key aspects of that are relevant for today's talk. There's monetary policy, which controls the inflation rate, and there's basically only very limited role for fiscal policy in that view. So it's all up to monetary policy. If the inflation rate, like it is in the US now, is 7%, and if it's not on target, it's the monetary policy's duty to bring it down. And then how is inflation determined? Well, inflation is a function that's basically the Phillips curve of current and future marginal cost, usually more modeled as unemployment. So the idea is that inflation is high when the economy is overheating, so when unemployment is low, and inflation is low when the economy is not doing so well and unemployment is high. Okay, let's try to see how that does in the data. Of course, there are some periods where it does well, but I want to argue that there are also some other periods where it doesn't do that well. Let's start with some simple cross-country comparisons and look at the experience of Switzerland and Turkey in the last decade. So what you see here is that so you see unemployment on the vertical axis and on horizontal axis and inflation on the vertical one. You see that Switzerland is known to be a very low inflation country, but it also has very low unemployment. On the other hand, Turkey is a high inflation country, and as we know, high inflation countries, you see that the blue dots are all over the place, has high volatility of inflation, but also high unemployment rate. So it's the opposite of what the Phillips curve would say, right? What the Phillips curve would say is that you have something like this. That's the relationship usually in the Phillips curve relationship. Here is when the economy is overheating. That's when you should have high inflation rate. Here, when the economy is there's a big output gap, and you should have a low inflation rate. Of course, you may argue that there might be some supply shocks, but then that would mean that that for Switzerland, the natural rate of unemployment for Switzerland to be overheating country, the natural unemployment rate should be somewhere around here. Given that the Phillips curve it's usually estimated to be pretty flat. So that comparison of these two countries doesn't look that good. And you can just pick some extreme ones. You see, I could go to some countries in South America. It looks even it's strengthened this point. Let's look at some other countries. Japan and Germany in the 70s. I could also now draw that for inflation and unemployment for those two countries, and you would get the same message, because you see Japan in the 70s, in contrast to what it is today, was a high inflation country. Inflation rate was quite high, much higher than Germany. And at the same time, Japan's unemployment rate was very low, below 2%. But I'm showing you that to make another point, to relate energy prices and inflation. Because some people argue then, as they do now, that inflation rates are high now, as they were then, just because of energy prices. It's all the fault of energy prices, and then monetary policy can do nothing about that. Because what can they do about energy prices that as there are some conflicts and wars in some parts of the world? When Milton Friedman was confronted with this statement, and he always said policy is relevant for inflation. It's largely a policy phenomenon. He exactly brought up that example. He said, how can it be, if energy prices are responsible for the high inflation rate, that Japan and Germany, which are kind of similarly import dependent on energy, have such different experience in inflation rates? He said that cannot be. It must be that in Germany and Japan have implemented different policies. And that's also the view that I'm going to propose today. And you're going to see I will relate to the Friedman's view. I tell you where my view coincides with him and where it differs, and how it generalizes what Friedman had in mind. Okay, that were cross-country comparisons. I mean, that's always, and you may object to that and say, okay, that's different countries. There are a lot of things different. It's very difficult to compare them. So now let's look instead on. Sorry, I missed the slide. Let's first. Sorry about that. I want to see what I'm talking about. What I want to say. I want to argue that fiscal policy is assigned a significant role in this, and the idea is that fiscal policy moves aggregate demand, and how it moves aggregate demand, it has an effect on the inflation rate. So fiscal policy here means the fiscal policy paying transfers, and this then stimulates households' spending behavior, and that leads to inflation. So that at the end, fiscal policy and monetary policy jointly determine the inflation rate. Let's look at the cross-country evidence for that. Here you see about 34 OECD countries, and you see on the vertical axis again the inflation rate, and on the horizontal axis you see nominal government expenditure, the growth rate of that. And you see here now a very strong relationship, correlation almost equal to 1. And you also find the two countries that we saw before. You have Switzerland here, very low inflation, and then also they have very low growth rate in nominal expenditures. Turkey, on the other hand, a high inflation country, has higher growth rate of nominal expenditures. I said the correlation is very high, but of course, at that point, it's just a correlation. I've not presented you any theory. I've not told you anything about causality, right? And at that point, of course, it's correlation. The causality can run both ways. Right? But the theory that I'm going to propose is that I want to say the causality runs from here to here. Right? That says if the government decides for higher nominal government expenditures or paying more transfers and have a higher growth rate of that, that will lead to higher inflation rate. But it could also be equally well that it runs from inflation to nominal expenditure. Right? There's high inflation rate, and of course, as a response to that, the government increased the transfers to preserve the purchasing power of the government. And what I'm gonna do today is I have from going from here to here, I'm gonna present you a theory that delivers that channel. Because we're going to see that in the standard new Keynesian model, you don't have that. There would be no effect of that. Or if at all, very small. Good. Now let's move to within the US. And say then we don't have to compare different countries, but just we do it within the US. And let's look at the late 1960s. And what I'm showing you there is the inflation rate and unemployment. And you see two things. You see that inflation, after a long period of being very low in the early 60s and before, now picked up. You see the red line is strongly increasing, going from values way below 2, reaching then values above 5%. But what about the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate was flat. It was 4% for most of the time, and only increased later. And why did it increase? Well, it increased just because monetary policy responded a little bit too late. You see the inflation rate picked up already here. Monetary policy was in this sense too loose. It was not trying to fight inflation rate, but increased only later. And when the monetary policy tightened, it had an effect, negative effect on unemployment rate, and they undid that immediately. I don't want to focus on monetary policy. I want to focus on the relationship between the flat line, the flat green line, the unemployment rate, and the increasing red line of inflation. So you see inflation increased, although on the tightness of the labor market, nothing changed. At least if you look at the unemployment rate. But then what happened as well? Then what happened to fiscal policy? There's a nice article by Christina Romer, among others, who describes that there was a change in the beliefs of fiscal policy in the early 1960s. So the people abandoned the view that the balanced budget is important and thought more that the unemployment rate of 4% is still too high, and we want to stimulate the economy to bring the unemployment rate even further down.
Sorry, Marcus, wait me a second. I need to. You need to share your screen again, please. Yes. Sorry for that, Marcus.
No problem. Right. So it happened, as I said, that there was a belief change in fiscal policy that they wanted to bring down the unemployment rate even further. So there was 4%. They thought they can bring it down to expansionary fiscal policy. And there were many dimensions of how they did it, and they also increased transfers. Here I'm showing you those transfers, which were largely income maintenance programs, and it's the blue line. It's again the growth rate of those transfers. And what happened is they picked up exactly at the same time when the inflation rate picked up. And I want to provide a theory which relates those two lines and provides a causal relationship between both of them.
Sorry, Marcus, I have a question.
Yeah.
Usually in new Keynesian models, we have these results that are we have a fiscal multiplier that increases, in which output increases after an increase in government spending or transfers in a model with heterogeneity, let's say, and you're gonna have this relationship anyways, no?
Yeah, but what you see, but how the fiscal, how the Phillips curve works. How the Phillips curve works, it operates all to the marginal cost, to unemployment. So if the fiscal multiplier doesn't move unemployment, it has no effect. It has no effect on inflation rate, and it has no effect on unemployment because it doesn't move it. So this is the unemployment. So there, in this, as I'm saying, there's an extra determinant of inflation that operates on top of the marginal cost. I'm not saying they're not operating. There's many periods where it works well, but there is something on top of that. So once you control for unemployment, some other stuff happens in addition to that.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the question. It was a good question. Right, and here the early 80s is the last of those time series graph I'm showing, is that here we had, how did the 1980s look like early? It was high inflation. And here I'm showing you inflation minus expectations, because of course the inflation rate in the new Keynesian model can also move if the long run inflation expectations move, right? If inflation anchor moves, it comes down, right? Because the policy is credible, because disinflation is credible, and then inflation can come down, although unemployment doesn't move. That's why the red line is not moving as much as the inflation rate, but it's still going up. So the inflation rate is high, but what happened to what is unemployment doing? Unemployment was also high, right? And now I'm showing you what inflation should have been according to the unemployment rate. Right? So I'm showing you the green line is minus a third of unemployment. It's minus because higher unemployment rate means lower inflation, and the third, that's the slope of the Phillips curve. That's the recent estimates that say to get 3% of inflation, 1% of inflation, you need 3% of unemployment increase. But here it was the unemployment rate so high, you saw the inflation rate should have come down. But what it did instead, it went up. And again, I mean, looking at fiscal transfers, they picked up. The blue line, the growth rate increased. And interestingly, you see it's leading that. It picked up, it peaked before the inflation rate peaked. So you have the usual leads, the leads like you do have in monetary policy, that we do something now. It takes some time before the effects take place. Okay, and as I said, I want to provide a theory which relates the blue and the red line. Why is that related on top of the green line? And you're going to see I do that all with flexible prices to focus only on that one, right? To take that new Keynesian effect completely out. But of course, if you move back to sticky prices, there would be a combination of both. Good. Let's relate it quickly to the views of two famous economists and start with Friedman. So what is Friedman's view from about more than 50 years ago, from his famous presidential address? He said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And that led then to the famous quantity equation that says money can add velocity, but you don't have to, is equal to P times Y. And it became a theory because he said the central bank moves M, and the way that moves M, it affects the prices in the economy. If M has a high growth rate, prices go a lot. If M is going little, you have little inflation. So how do I differ from that? Well, what I'm changing is it's similar to what Friedman does, but generalizes it. It says that instead of saying inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, I'm saying it's a nominal phenomenon. What do I mean by that? I'm saying I'm using, instead of the quantity equation, I'm using this equation, where D is now here, the nominal demand is total spending in euros, dollars, pesos, whatever is the currency in the country of interest. That has to be equal to P times Y. And then it becomes a theory, because I'm going to argue today that fiscal policy affects the nominal demand. Because if without that link, it's just an accounting identity. Right? That's basically defining the GDP deflator. There's nothing, it's hard to object with that. It becomes a theory because I'm saying that the nominal demand depends on fiscal policy, but it also depends on monetary policy, and of course on a lot of other factors. And this I'm gonna show you how that works and what assumptions I need for that. How I have to deviate from the complete market model that's used in the new Keynesian model. And then you see that Friedman arises as a special case. It's a special case because in Friedman's view, central bank basically controls nominal demand. And it's easy to see in the case when we have velocity is equal to 1. Because what is nominal demand in that model? Like in a simple, basic textbook cash advance model. The households need money from the central bank to do their spending. So the total nominal demand in the economy is M, the money supply of the central bank. That's a total nominal demand. That's how many That's the nominal GDP in that country. It's fully controlled by the central bank, fully controlled because they set M. And in this case, D is equal to M. And what I'm talking about today is reducing to Friedman. But it's going to be more general than that. That's just a special case. It's a special case because now it's going to be that fiscal policy is also affecting that. And in addition of nowadays, we're not thinking of central bank setting M, but setting the nominal interest rate. But if you go back to the textbook case, the two theories are going to be coinciding. Good. That was Friedman. Of course, you may wonder now. What I'm suggesting is how fiscal policy affects nominal demand and therefore prices and inflation. So in some sense, I'm proposing some kind of fiscal theory of the price level. The inflation is explained by fiscal elements. Right? So let's compare that to fiscal theory of the price level and look at John Cochrane had to say about the recent U.S. inflation. Where I agree about a lot of points, but I'm going to see where it's going to be a deviation. So first, he describes just the facts, right? So in response to the COVID-19 crisis, the Treasury issued about $3 trillion of new debt, and then sent out checks, which ended up in people's bank account. Of course, that the Fed was in between because bought basically all of the debt. But that, I agree with John, that's irrelevant for inflation. So these are the two facts. And now, how does that lead to inflation? Well, he used the parable of the helicopter drop, but the fiscal helicopter drop is a helicopter that starts from the Treasury and distributes checks in the economy. How does that lead to inflation? According to the fiscal theory of the price level, well, that's a quote now. Inflation comes when government debt increases relative to people's expectations of what the government will repay. That's just FDPR with a non-recurring policy. Right? And the idea behind that is, if the policy is non-recurring, then households increase their spending. So what's the idea behind that? So that there is new debt, they're getting checks, and what they're thinking is, will the government repay the debt at some point? Technically, it's important to notice that means that they have to check the transversality condition of the government, because the flow budget constraint is always satisfied. It's a present value budget constraint. Right? So you have to think, is the transversality condition satisfied? But could mean that our taxes increase in 500 years, right? Because the transversality condition is something, the t goes to infinity. And here's also where I deviate from the fiscal theory of the price level. Here's also going to be that this increase in government spending will increase household spending, but I deviate from that theory here. I assume a different reason why they increase their spending. But the FDPR that breaks recurrent equivalence in the government sector, and we have to increase government spend. I have to break recurrent equivalence because otherwise, sending transfers in complete markets, that doesn't do anything, right? That's recurrent equivalence. It needs to be broken, and they break it on the government side, and then it leads to household spending kind of indirectly. It's a little bit of it's not really modeled explicitly. So what the demand theory of the price level does, that's how I call my theory, is that it breaks the recurrent equivalence on the household sector. Why do I prefer that? I prefer that because there's a large empirical literature that says when households receive a check, they're not behaving like permanent income households. Some of them spend the money all directly because they're in need. Some of them spend half of it in the first year. They're not smoothing the consumption over time as the permanent income hypothesis would say. So then they don't have to assume that the government, the fiscal policy is not recurrent. I assume technically that the fiscal policy is passive. So there's recurrent there. The transversality condition of the government is always satisfied. Right? So I don't have to, always have to argue why. The FDPL is a little bit hard to verify empirically, right? Because who knows what the government does in 500 years, and this would be relevant. So I prefer this one because that's easier to check. We have better hope of understanding whether households spend their checks, why they spend it, and who spends it, and what are the marginal propensity of consumption of various households. Good. If you don't have any questions, I believe now I can go to a simple model. I'm going to move in steps. I first show you a simple model before I go to general incomplete market models. I go to incomplete market models because these are the models that give me this consumption behavior. I mean, not perfectly matching consumption behavior, I mean, which model does, but of course they give you the heterogeneity in NPCs. They give you they can replicate the results that people have found in the data. But to understand the mechanism, I start with a simpler model. It's a two-agent model. It builds on a recent paper by Florin. It's a tank, and usually it's a K here if you're familiar with the literature for Keynesian. I put a C. It's for classic because I'm using flexible prices. It's not no innovation. That just reminds me that I have to tell you that I'm using flexible prices. But other than that, of course, Florin has it with sticky prices. But to illustrate the points, it's easier to do it with flexible prices. Otherwise, you have all these profits moving around, and it just blows up the notation. Good. So the model is quite simple. There are two types of households. There's hand-to-mouth households, and there are savers. There are 50-50. That's irrelevant. It's just that makes also some things easier. Let's describe what two households do. So there's incompleteness. That means that the hand-to-mouth consumers, and there's extreme incompleteness. The hand-to-mouth consumer have to consume their current income. The current income that's WT. You can think of the wage income or some endowment. Plus they receive a nominal transfer T, and PT is the price level. So that's the real value of transfers. That's the wage. That's the total income in real terms they have. They consume that. They have no option to save. That's the hand-to-mouth. That's the incompleteness there. It means that if you give them some money, they have an MPC of 1, very high MPC. The savers are different. The savers are different. They can buy a bond. They maximize utility. They have a wage income WT. They have an higher than 1, higher by a factor of chi, because that's kind of already anticipating that the incomplete market model is coming, so that these are the high income households. These are the high income households. The hand-to-mouth consumers are the ones that are credit constrained, and they're the low income households. Then that's their labor income. They have bond income from the last period. This I is the nominal interest rate, is constant here. They can acquire new bonds. That's the real value of those, and they have to pay taxes. Exactly what the hand-to-mouth consumers receive. And now it's important that we have a transition matrix, like an incomplete model, like an Hagerdorn model. There are shocks. Otherwise, there's no incompleteness in that model, because you have income shocks that you cannot perfectly ensure as in a complete market model. So the households can move between types according to this transition matrix. Right? So, example, omega SH is the probability that the saver becomes a hand-to-mouth household, and I'm assuming that this one is not 0. So there's a positive probability that the saver becomes a hand-to-mouth household. And that's going to be relevant because you can imagine that has changed the saving behavior and the consumption behavior of the saver quite a bit. Good. So then we have fiscal and monetary policy. The monetary policy sets the nominal interest rate, assuming that this is smaller than 1 over beta. It's a standard result in our assumption in incomplete market models. There's nominal transfers T, and to make life easy, we have the bonds equal to 0 here, so it's balanced budget. So the saver can make a saving decision, but in equilibrium, the saving is going to be 0. so they don't have to keep track of the debt. Good. So that's the model, and I'm telling you how in that model do we determine inflation and prices. And let's start with the steady state, and most of the all of the talk, except for the second half of that slide. You see that? I'm already on the. Do you see this slide with steady state and local determinacy?
No. We're still seeing the simple tank model.
Why is that not showing now? That's not good.
We saw it at some point.
No, that's a slide in that's in two slides. There's one slide in the middle that never happened to me. How can that be? Do you understand how that's possible? There we are. No. Funny program. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, steady state and price level. Steady state inflation, that is kind of straightforward. And I want to say I'm focusing on the steady state, doing basically all of the talk, except for the second half of that slide here, where we just mentioned quickly what happens locally around the steady state. Because the steady state, that's the in my view, that's the key innovation. Okay, how's the steady state inflation rate determined? Right? So that's kind of easy, right? Because in a steady state, what happens is that the real value of transfers has to be constant, because it's a steady state. Right? Like consumption is constant, steady in a normal model, capital stock is constant, everything is constant. Of course, you can have a growing economy, but we abstract from that. That's constant. But if that's constant, it means that the numerator and denominator, they have to go at the same rate. Right? What does it mean? It means that the growth rate of transfers has to be equal to the inflation rate. That's just a condition for this. Of course, that's just an accounting identity. That just means it's a steady state. It becomes a theory if the fiscal policy now actively uses this. So if there's a deliberate decision of the fiscal policy, you say, before that I had that 2%, now I want to increase that to 5%. If we move from 2 to 5% for this one, eventually, if we reach the new steady state, it goes from 2 to 5%. But that requires that when it changes, and then it goes from here to the inflation. So that's the inflation rate. The price level, that's a little bit more involved. And for that, we have to look at the first order condition of the saver. And let's assume the inflation rate is equal to 0 for simplicity here. It doesn't matter, but it makes some notation a little bit easier. Here we have the first order condition of the saver, the Euler equation. It's a standard Euler equation. Only have to be aware that we have to more is uncertainty. We can have that's the probability to stay a saver. Then we get the marginal utility of the saver tomorrow. But with a certain probability omega sh, the household can become a hand-to-mouth household, and then we're going to have that's the relevant marginal utility. And then equilibrium that has to be equalized. Notice that I already assumed impose the equilibrium condition that B is equal to 0, right? So usually you would have here some B in it, but I always used that it is 0 in equilibrium. Right? So the saver has to be happy with not saving at all, with zero bonds, with holding 0 bonds. And that now also explains how the price level is determined. And here the relevant issue is not whether some P star like this exists, but whether it's unique. Because it's about the price level determinacy. It's not the problem that you don't find a price level that is consistent with equilibrium. The problem usually is the problem of indeterminacy is that you have continuum of too many of them. So let's see how does it work? Why is it determined? Now suppose we have P. We had P bigger than P star. What would that mean? That means that T over P, because this is constant, I'm not changing that. That falls. So the real value of transfer falls. What does it mean for the saving decision of the saver? Well, he understands that this one falls. That is the consumption of the hand-to-mouth household. That's the rainy day for the saver. That's a bad state. That's a state with this probability, the saver becomes a low-income household. It's transfer dependent. Now with the prior price level, that falls. So what's the response of the saver? Well, the saver wants to increase the precautionary saving, because it does not only save for intertemporal reasons, right? That was just usually intertemporal substitution, but this one gives him induces precautionary savings demand. So he increases because of that. The household demands more bonds. The precautionary saving goes up, but that's not an equilibrium. That's not an equilibrium. Right? The saving is too high and the consumption is too low. Demand goes down, savings go up. It's not an equilibrium. Neither asset market nor goods market clear. And you can do the same thing for if the price level is, assume the price level is less than P star. What then happens is the real value of transfers goes up. Then what happens here? Then tomorrow, the rainy day is not that bad. The low income state suddenly looks better. Then the savers thought, why should I save that much? I could reduce my savings. I reduce my savings and increase my consumption. But again, that's not an equilibrium, because an equilibrium requires this B equal to 0. There's only one price level where exactly the saver is willing to have B equal to 0. And that pins down the price level. And you see it's critical. It's critical that that is nominal, or at least partially nominal, so that movements in the price level have an effect on the real value of these fiscal variables. So when the government sends out checks, it sends out the checks in dollars, and not in. It's not that you can buy specific goods with that. You can do that also as well, but there has to be a nominal component. Otherwise, it's not working. That's an important assumption. Right? And so in this simple model, that gives you the inflation rate, and it gives you the price level, steady state. As I told you, I don't want to talk about local determinacy. So whether there are also other equilibrium around the steady state, because that's a little bit complicated. I mean, Florin has worked on that in these tank models. I have worked on that in the incomplete market model, which is even more involved than that. It's a paper of its own. I just want to give you the flavor of what's happening. From the steady state result, you might not be surprised that if the nominal interest rate is constant and the transfer is constant, that then you have local determinacy. Why? Because under these conditions, I just showed you that the steady state price level is already determined. Usually in a new Keynesian model, what you would need is the Taylor rule, that the nominal interest rate increases more than 1-to-1 with the inflation rate. Right? You need that to have the price level determined in that model. Given that the constant nominal interest rate already does that, might not be too surprising that we have local determinacy in that case. However, we not always have local determinacy. It's here that the policy might not prevent indeterminacy, it might induce indeterminacy. And you see that we can make the transfers depending on P. And the result is that if this phi, T is equal to P to the power of phi, that if phi is bigger or larger or equal to 1, then we're going to have a indeterminacy, we're going to have a fiscal price spiral. So it's a little bit more complicated to explain it, but you can see that in the case of phi equal to 1, that is a problem. Why is that a problem? Because suppose the price goes up by 5%. What does phi equal to 1 mean? T also goes up by 5%. So that the fiscal policy fully accommodates any price movements, any belief, anything that happens. It looks out of the window, sees someone set the prices up by 5%, it increases that. So if it does that, then T over P, it's not changing. So the whole equilibrium doesn't change. We have the same equilibrium as before, but we can have the same equilibrium for 5%. We can do the same thing for 1%. We can do the same thing for 3%. So that means the equilibrium would not be determinate. And then we have to use the same logic as in the new Keynesian model. Then monetary policy has to step in, has to increase the nominal interest rate when it sees prices increasing, and has to kill off those equilibria. That's exactly the same. The same logic. Good. As said, I'm not going to come back to local determinacy, but for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about steady state, and now generalize those insights to an incomplete market model of the Hagerdorn type. And for most of that, I'm using a purely graphic analysis. So how am I doing in time?
You have 25 minutes left.
And let me also quickly do that, because it's I may not come to, yeah. So we can that was on the previous slide. It was from a saver's perspective. Now we take from the demand perspective, right? Because I told you what the theory is that I want to do is want to have D equal to PT times YT. So you have to define the nominal demand. What's the nominal demand in that economy? It's the weighted sum of the nominal demand of the hand-to-mouth households and the savers. And you have this nominal demand that gives it a price level satisfying this equation, right? Of course, for that to be relevant and for fiscal policy to have an effect, what we need is that the change in fiscal policy has an effect on nominal demand. So let's look at the change in fiscal policy. Change transfers of the savers and the hand-to-mouth households. What does that do to the nominal demand? Well, depends on what the marginal propensities to demand or consumers are of those households. They receive a check. What are they doing with that? How much of that are they spending? That's how it affects the nominal demand. And now, if you give a check to the hand-to-mouth households, and the savers have to pay for that, something like that, what happens to nominal demand? Well, in a complete market model, or if all households are identical, nothing happens. What one household spends more, the other household spend less. But here, if there's heterogeneity in the marginal propensities to consume, like here, you're going to have a change in the nominal demand. So that means the change in the fiscal policy changes the D, and if change the D, we're going to have to have a different a different price level. Good. So now I want to generalize those two insights to an incomplete market model of the Hagerdorn guideline. And we're starting with the we can take two perspectives. One can look at from the saving decision, and we can look at from the demand decision. I'm starting with the saving decision and see where if I get to the demand view. I start with the saving decision because this figure here that I'm showing you here, that's the standard way to present the steady state of this incomplete market model. So what is shown here is steady state. You have the real interest rate here. You have assets and bonds here. You see the real interest rate in the steady state has to be less than 1 over beta, standard result. Then we have the household's real saving or asset demand is that curve here, which for simplicity is here an upward sloping curve. And we have the real value of bonds on that side, B over P. Right? And then we would have the equilibrium here. Does that determine the price level? Not yet. Why? Because what you can have is like this. You can have, why do I put it here? I can put it here, I can put it here. You can have this value of real bonds, this value or this value, all associated with different price levels. So that's not determining the price level. It tells you there's an infinite amount of prices possible. However, it also means that we have each of these prices is associated with a different real interest rate. The low one, medium one, a high one here. And now I'm going to argue that policy is determining the real interest rate, fiscal policy and nominal policy jointly. So how does that work? Well, the real interest rate, that's just a Fisher equation, is the ratio of the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate. The nominal interest rate is set by monetary policy. It's important here that I make the same assumption as nowadays everybody makes, that the monetary policy sets the nominal return on bonds. In the fiscal policy, and not money supply, in the fiscal policy, they are setting quantities. They're setting the level of bonds, government spending, and transfers, and taxes. And what happens in the steady state? In the steady state, the real value of bonds, government spending, etc., have to be constant again. That's a definition of a steady state, so that the growth rate, just as in the simple example before, has to be equal to the inflation rate. So if the fiscal policy sets that equal to 2%, inflation rate is 2%. If it sets that to 5%, inflation rate is going to be 5%. And this inflation rate now gives you this one, the inflation rate here. The nominal interest rate comes from monetary policy. You get the real interest rate. And then we just have to look on the horizontal axis where that real interest rate is. Go here and then pick one of those equilibria exactly where we have the dashed line intersects the red line, because then we know the total asset demand of that economy. And once we know this, asset market clearing means that gives us that P star. And then the P star, then we have the P star, steady state price level determined, and we have the inflation rate determined, just like here. So we have the steady state conditions are this one and this one. Determining inflation rate, determining the price level. Asset market clearing, and that's just a steady state condition for the inflation rate. You may wonder, how does it work with capital? That's no problem. Right? If you have capital, we just add it to that condition. Here we have it with capital and bonds that perfect substitutes. You can also make it non-perfect substitutes. That doesn't matter. So you have the total asset demand, and then P star has to solve that equation, taking into account that some of that asset demand goes to physical capital. How about money? We don't have money here in the model because the central bank sets nominal interest rate and could say we could appeal to the cashless limit. But suppose we do not, and we have money in it. Right? Then what we get? Then we get a second equation. We get a second equation. L is the money demand for rebalances. So we have this is clearing the money market. We have still the bond market clearing, and we have still this condition. It determines the inflation rate, where the causality runs now from bonds, say bonds at 2%, inflation rate is 2%. And now it's important to understand one aspect is that money is endogenous, because the central bank is not setting money, it's setting the nominal interest rate. So the logic is now as follows. The fiscal policy sets this one. That gives you this one, the inflation rate. And then this one determines what the money growth rate has to be. Because in the steady state, households want to keep the rebalances constant. And then we have the inflation rate. This gives us this. The real interest rate is again determined. This gives us that. And then the central bank has to provide, once we know this P star, and we know this one, the central bank has to provide this amount of money. And that's the way how they implement a nominal interest rate. They set the price of money, the opportunity cost of money. They set the nominal interest rate, and then, but then they have to stand ready to satisfy all the money demand coming in, and then this equation is satisfied as well. Good. That's the same thing, just with open market operations. So they have the M subtracting here, but it's the same logic. It's even easier because now you can this condition and this condition together give you this condition, right? And you can just read off the price level just from that equation. But the whole logic is the same, and the important insight is that money is endogenous. So they're not using. You cannot use this equation to determine the price level. In Friedman, that would be exogenous, and then you get the price level from here. Now here, B is exogenous and M is endogenous. Why? Because now the nominal interest rate is the exogenous one set by monetary policy. They're not setting M. Okay, why doesn't it work with complete markets? Because in steady state, complete markets looks like this. Looks like this. You have just this vertical line. The steady state real interest rate is 1 over beta. And there's only one real interest rate consistent with a steady state in a complete market model. It's 1 over beta. So this thing is vertical, reflecting that households are willing to absorb any amount of bonds in a steady state. So you can have this value here, this value, or this value. They're all consistent with the steady state. From looking at the steady state equation, you cannot tell whether you're here, here, or here. And it means you don't know whether the price level is P1 star, P2 star, or P3 star. Price level is indeterminate. The same thing happens if you have a tank model. Tank model is the 2-agent model that I showed you before. But why I'm saying now the price level is not determined? Well, because in a usual tank model, if you're a saver, you stay a saver forever. And if you are a hand-to-mouth consumer, you stay a hand-to-mouth consumer forever. But remember, when I argued for the determinacy result, I used extensively that changing the price level leads to different value of the transfers, and that was relevant because it changed the consumption value of the hand-to-mouth households, and the saver cared about that and changed how much he or she wants to engage in precautionary savings because of that. But if the saver stays a saver forever, it completely behaves like a per income household, and then this figure here applies to that household as well. So it's critical that you have this uncertainty, because the uncertainty gives you the precautionary saving demand, and then you get a saving curve that looks more like this. So basically the general lesson is what you need something that is not looking like this, but is looking like this. So you should have many real interest rates potentially that lead to different saving rates. Incomplete market model give you that. Tank model does not. So I should say incomplete market model of the Hager type give you that. course, you can have other models. Say you can have your preferred bounded rationality model that gives you something like that. Price level would also be determined. But of course, one has to be careful and has to check it all the time and to make sure that everything works well. But the general lesson is that you need something like that. That the asset decision, the asset market clearing condition, is not trivial, just like that, because then you see the whole logic breaks down. As that you get this curve just by taking the simple empirical fact into account that markets are incomplete. That's widely documented. Plus, you need that the fiscal policy is partly nominal. Good.
Marcus, I have a small question.
Sure.
So in practice, all these models have, for example, a Hank model can be written. Practice, we have to write the model in nominal terms, let the price level be an endogenous variable, and you, on top of that, need another equation, or you get this price level for free when you set the nominal bonds, for example.
I get that. It's for free. I don't need anything more.
Okay, so any model has these features, and you just have to rewrite your model in nominal terms. Let's say.
I said you need this property here.
Yes.
You need that one. Once you have this property, you are in business.
Okay, so I have that property.
But this and this saving curve, that is completely real.
Yes.
That's the describes real. You can even write a household site completely in real terms in that simple model here, and then just say it's the real demand for savings. It has to match that, and only then comes the nominal side into in consideration. In the simple tank model that I showed you, then it's a little bit more involved. Then you have to take into account that the transfers are nominal.
I see. So for example, usually we solve the equilibrium of these models, and we have a target for real bonds, and you set an interest rate. You have this equilibrium, and then you say, okay, I want to know what's the price level for this level for a given level of nominal bonds, for example. And you get and that's the price level, and it's going to be unique and so on. No?
Exactly.
That's the point. Okay.
Yeah, because usually you see what the logic usually is. You say, I calibrate this model, then look at the data and see, oh, the debt to GDP ratio is, say, 80%. I put that in the model. Then I say, what is the income process? I put this in the model. I calibrate the whole model. And then I have to make sure that the asset market clears. What do I do usually? I solve for the real interest rate that clears the asset market. Because usually what I do, I say, this one here, this is 80% of GDP. Then I go here, and then I go here down, and I'm here, and say, okay, I need the interest rate has to be 2% or 2.1% to get that. So here the logic is opposite. The policy determines the real interest rate, and then we go the opposite way.
I see.
We go from here to here. So in this sense, it's even easier to solve because we don't have at least in a steady state, it's easier to solve because you already know the real interest rate in the steady state.
Good. And I have another question. Would this work in a model with more than one good?
Yes.
This would be like the average price of all goods in the economy, no?
Yeah, that's usually I'm absolutely. That is just the usually price indicator. I mean, you can have many, like in the new Keynesian model, you can have the Dixit-Stiglitz aggregator. You have, as you know, you have many goods, and that this price is then the usual price index.
Okay.
Usually, how you usually find the CPI in that model.
Thanks, Mark.
At least that's the most meaningful way to do it. Okay. So I think I have not that much time. Let's skip. I'm going to skip that technical part, and I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about what happens if monetary policy is tightened, and I want to talk a little bit about forward guidance, because that model changes things quite a bit. Right? You have now to ignore this part. That's I skipped describing what it does, but we can do everything on the left hand side. The left hand side is just the asset market that I just described. Right? You have the real interest rate here. You have assets here. It's exactly the same word as before, and we are starting. The way where we start is here, E star. An intersection of the saving curve, the light red one. The real interest rate is here, and then we are at this point, and the price level is going to be here. It's exactly replicating the figure from before. And now what I'm doing is I'm moving to a new steady state with a higher nominal interest rate. So what happens is this curve here, you see this curve, dashed line moves to the right because the real interest rate is now going to be higher. Well, then if we then move just along that line here, we would be somewhere here, and that would be the new price level. And you see this price level, what it is, the real value of bonds is higher, this P star, that P forwards. So we have in a new steady state with a higher nominal interest rate, we're going to have a lower price level. But we are not fully done, because the higher nominal interest rate, that also means higher taxes. So we have to shift this curve a little bit. So actually a real curve now is something like this. So we're going to end up here. Because the taxes go up, households going to save less because they have fewer resources available. But the point is, if we do this, we see that the price level falls. And the picture is then something like this. If you start in this zero inflation steady state, the price level was like this, and then it's going to go to a new lower level. And what's important is now here the inflation rate was 0, and in a new steady state, the inflation rate is also 0. But in the transition, the price level is falling. Why I'm emphasizing that? I'm emphasizing that because what does usually happen if we increase the nominal interest rate permanently? Well, we get Fisherian effects. If you do that in a standard New Keynesian model, if you increase the nominal interest rate by 2%, what happens is, if this goes up by 2%, the inflation rate goes up by 2%, because the real interest rate has to be constant. It's exactly that. That's the view. That's how in Turkey, how President Erdogan is thinking about fighting inflation. How does he want to fight inflation? He wants to say, we bring this down, and the result is that then inflation goes down, right? We have bring the nominal interest rate down, and inflation goes down. And everybody, or many commentators, are mocking him for that. What a crazy, unorthodox theory is that? No, it's a leading theory. If you're fully committed to that, and you do it, Keynes steady state, do it for a long time or even forever, that's the way how to bring inflation down. I have even a paper 15 years ago that in these models, that's the way to go. Commitment to lower nominal interest rates. So the model is complete, it has fully incorporated Fisherian effect. Of course, in the short run, that's not correct, but if you do it long enough, that's going to happen. Here, it does not. It does not. If you do that policy, has no effect on inflation as long as fiscal policy is not responding. If fiscal policy does nothing and keeps increasing transfers at 10% every year, you're going to have 10% inflation. Bringing down the nominal interest rate just lowers your real interest rate. It brings down inflation for some time. That was this year. But eventually, you're going to be back where you were. So it's not Fish-sharing effect. It's no Fish-sharing effect. And then you move to the new steady state. You have you move around to real interest rate, but you're not moving the inflation rate. And obviously, you have to decide between. You cannot have both. Either you have an effect on the real interest rate, or you have an effect on the inflation. Good. So then let's finish up with talking about forward guidance, because there also the conclusion changes quite a bit relative to the complete market model. Good. Let's look forward guidance in a liquidity trap. Right? So what does a liquidity trap do? We have here inflation rate, and there was a bad shock that brings inflation down a lot. And in this model, if inflation is down, you have a big negative output gap as well. And what is then forward guidance doing? Well, it has a big effect. It has a big effect on the inflation rate. It moves the inflation rate up quite a bit, and it also means that output goes up enormously. It goes up so much that this was called the forward guidance puzzle. Small change in nominal interest rates, say in 5 years. And your forward guidance means that you're not increasing the interest rate, although you should say, according to the Taylor rule, now in 5 years, but you do it only in 6 years. So at 5 years, you should have increased nominal interest. You should increase nominal interest rate, but you commit not to do that, but do it only a little bit later, and that has enormous effect on current output and on current inflation. That's why it's called the forward guidance puzzle, because people thought that seems a little bit big. And to understand why it does not happen here, we have to see what happens to the price level. If we have this initial shock of that drives inflation down a lot, and then inflation rate converges back, what that means to the price level, it keeps falling and then converges to a new lower level. Right? That does not happen in the model that I've just shown you. In this heterogeneous agent model with nominal bonds, that's not what's happening. Why not? Because and forward guidance is only about changing monetary policy. If you're not changing fiscal policy, right, it means that the price level has to converge back. If it starts here, it has to converge back to here. If you translate this convergence back to its original level, because it's determined, it's the same one. If it converges back, it means in inflation rate, it means that inflation rate is first negative, but eventually has to look like this. And then if you try forward guidance in this model, on the blue line, right, forward guidance to be effective as in a complete market model, what it should do is it has to move the inflation rate a lot, because that's required to move output a lot. But what does that light blue line relative to the dark blue line mean for the price level? Well, the dark blue line means the price level converges back to its steady state level. The light blue line would mean that the price level goes up to some higher price level. Again, that's inconsistent with unchanged fiscal policy. The nominal interest rate cannot do that to temporary changes in its level. And that's the reason why what we find in program is driving me crazy. I get a quick summary of the whole talk. That's why we find. I didn't see the total dilemma. Disaster. Okay, so here this is what we find. Another paper with Jin Feng, Yuri, and Kurt, published in JME a few years ago. We did the forward guidance experiment, the same forward guidance experiment that people do in the complete market model. And here you see what forward guidance means in that case. It just means this. That's the nominal interest rate. That's the norm without forward guidance. It's here called naive. And the blue one, that is forward guidance. You just keep the nominal interest rate lower for a bit, and then you move back to the same level. And you see what happens to output and inflation. Basically nothing. Very, very small effect. Well, because this is a very small change in monetary policy, and it's even only in the future, in 10 quarters. So it has, you see here, basically, if you do the red and the blue line, basically no difference. So it's no forward guidance puzzle. It's just normal effect that you would expect from a monetary model. Okay, I think I'm kind of on time. Let me just summarize in a few seconds what I have done and what I think is important. So what I want to argue is that two assumptions that I consider not very controversial. Markets are incomplete, so not everybody is like a permanent income household, and fiscal policy is nominal. For example, bonds are nominal. That gives you a new theory of price level and inflation determination. So even if you don't like what I'm saying, once you buy those two assumptions, you basically have to deal with what I'm having to say, because then the mechanisms that I described to you are operating. So either you have to say, I don't believe that bonds are nominal, I believe that they are fully indexed, I doubt that's true, or I assume that markets are incomplete, but that's certainly not a good assumption. But once you agree that these are relevant assumptions, the mechanism that I described, they are relevant. You have to think about whether the asset market clears, what's the role of the prices in that, and what's the role of fiscal and monetary policy in determining those prices. And when you do that, you assign an important, significant role to fiscal policy, also in determining the inflation rate. Of course, the flip side is that now monetary policy has also some relevant role in inequality and redistribution across households, etc. Right? So they basically, fiscal policy takes some of the classic tasks of the monetary policy, and the monetary policy then has some effects what usually fiscal policy cares about. So there's they're much more linked together, and you can imagine that if they cooperate, that would be much better than if they go against each other. Right? And then emphasize two implications of that. One was that you have no forward guidance puzzle, and then you don't have these fee sharing effects. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks for the really nice talk. Anyone has any more questions?
Jorge here from the bank. Very interesting. So I wonder quantitatively, if you go to the data and get the input responses from government spending to price level, and you calibrate the incomplete market model, how does it do quantitatively matching the evidence? Have you worked on that? Is that something you're planning to look at?
Absolutely, that's a good question. I'm actually working on that. And the setup I'm using is, I look at fiscal transfers within the US. So I'm not using it just as time series, but at how inflation responds in different US states to fiscal transfers, largely from the federal level. And I find that these have quite sizable effects on inflation rate. And the figures I showed you at the beginning were in the US in the 1980s and 1960s. These were actually already using the transfers that I'm using multiplied with the importance that I'm finding in the empirical analysis. So they were not just completely made up. There were already results of some empirical investigation. So it's the same setup as in a recent paper by Hazel and Renyo, Akamura and Steinson. They estimate the Phillips curve by looking at basically the same setup, how unemployment rate, if it changes in one state, how it affects the inflation rate. So it's a QGA paper that's forthcoming now. And I'm saying if you if you adding transfers to that setup, they have an important effect on top of unemployment, consistent with these figures I showed you at the beginning.
Okay.
That was cool.
Thank you.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
If you have a monetary policy that targets, in the last period, you have that monetary.
So I have difficulties understanding you.
My point is, what's happened if you have a monetary policy that targets, for example, small business, or give like what you see in the last crisis, at least for example in Chile and some other countries, that you have a monetary policy that do something that could be almost similar to a transfer, directed transfers to different people, something that try to complete the market.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So here, what I'm, of course, it could be that here, what they're calling here monetary policy, I identify that with setting the nominal interest rate, and fiscal policy I identify with paying transfers. Of course, it's possible that the central bank does part of the job of the fiscal policy. That's certainly possible. And then, of course, it doesn't matter, of course, here who does it. It just matter what's actually happening. So has a little bit of a theoretical flavor, what I'm saying, in the sense that I identify monetary policy with nominal interest rate and not with various different operations of maybe even sending checks to people or policies that look like transfers.
So it's also you should see that's maybe during the last episode of the COVID, you have both things. Sometimes you see that during the last episode of the pandemic, you have the two things that was not so common in the past, that you see a lot of monetary policy that try to target through the banking sector, different type of firms, for example, given, I don't know, some type of either
but that's I think. But this one, this effect, this one I would think is different from happening here. That's more like financial stabilization and making sure. And I have to think about that honestly more. But I mean, one aspect is certainly to make sure that those firms, if they have liquidity needs, that this is not an issue. I have not thought about if you have a model with where you have firms and financial frictions, what the monetary policy does, how that affects, or whether that operates in a similar way to what I have. I have to think about that. But that's a good point.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for the nice presentation again, Marcus, and for the assistance. Let me remind you that this gonna be the webinars every Wednesday at 11:30, and we are doing this again next week. Okay, so thank you very much for coming, and see you, Marcus. Thanks. We're going to practice session.